Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Mindsets podcast. I'm your host, Angus Cook, and today we're in a new setting. And that will be very readily explained in a moment, but I'm going to immediately pass over to today's guest to do their own introduction. You want to take over?
I'm Georgia, I'm 22 and I'm a power rower from Buckinghamshire.
Indeed. Now, one of the reasons that we are actually not in the same setting, we are actually at the same address, but we've just gone from upstairs to downstairs, is because you're a power rower. And we will get further into the story of that because you haven't always been, which I think is going to be really interesting for those listening and particularly motivational. So if anyone's on a run right now, be prepared to probably PB on your time, or if you're doing anything else, you're going to PB. Now, we typically start this podcast with show and tell. So I have no idea what you've brought along, but I'm quite excited to see. Do you want to reveal all to everyone that's watching? If you're not watching, don't worry, I'm going to do a great audio description, but this is a great time for you to go over to the YouTube channel at Mindsets_podcast and take a look at what we're up to.
I mean, I have a couple bits.
Yeah, a couple bits.
Yeah,
Go on.
Some are good with mine, but I mean...
Do tell.
My first one's probably my most important one. It was my first ever race number at internationals, and it's still somehow all together.
Does that become a lucky number in any way?
No, but I have it up wherever I go, like going through something. It's always kind of with me.
0236.
Yeah, exactly.
If you want to try Georgia's phone password, you've got a good guess to start with
That'd
that.
actually be such a good idea. I should have done that. The next, obviously a medal. It's always been, it was my first ever World Championship medal. So again, holds a lot of...
Can you do a little... It's a gold medal, by the way. Can you do a little ding on it to prove that it is metal and it's not... Oh, it's the real deal. It's the real deal.
But yeah, it's looking a bit worse for wear. And then these, I mean, there's loads of them. These were Polaroids I got with everyone that came to visit in hospital. And what I tend to do in some of my training sessions when I'm doing trials or something, I take one with me because it kind of reminds me like where I came from, but also the love and support around me. So yeah, so every time someone visited, I mean, there's loads of them, we got a Polaroid and I just dropped them all.
That's all right. It's artwork. We'll make sure that we collect them all in a moment. Amazing. So with the Polaroids and everything like that, there's some great artwork going on here in the Mindset studio. We've got a couple of pictures on the floor. We will make sure that they're safe and sound. Don't worry. Okay, so show and tell. I think successful in terms of having a few different things to talk about there as we roll into your sport. So you haven't always been in a wheelchair, as we mentioned. But I do get the impression you were also quite sporty when you were young. Where did that come from? Was that parental influence or just your own personal interest?
Yeah, my family have always been very sporty. Definitely, every holiday was a sporting holiday or something like that. And my older brother was an athlete as well. So kind of following his footsteps and went down the sport route very quickly.
So... was your older brother into water sports, or was that more just your own interest as well?
It was more me. I was a water baby, always have been. He was not so much. He was a rugby player and then American football, so he was more the on land. I was more the water.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but 10 years old, when you're not very, I don't know, it's not very normal to go and look at kayaking and be like, that's the sport that I want to do. What was it that jumped out at you about kayaking?
I'd moved to the local area where I now live, and it's very much based around the Thames. So a lot of the sports there are rowing, kayaking, just an open day. And they were doing little funny races, and my brother and I were there, and, I was 10, he was 15, and I beat him. So for me, that was a moment where I loved the sport straight away. And
suddenly you've got something to just be better at than your brother.
Oh yeah, and he still hears about it to this day.
Oh, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I would still be bringing that in. So with kayaking then, I'm going to ask you a question, which I'm sure you've had multiple times. And I'm sure, if we're being honest, there's a few listeners here that are also thinking the same. What is the difference between a kayak and a canoe?
The easiest way to kind of describe it is kayak, you have the paddle and it has two blades each side. So you're paddling on both sides, whereas canoeing tends to be kind of the paddle shaft and then one blade on one side. So you're paddling on just the one side.
And what's the difference I've seen some kayaking in the Olympics, for example, especially when it was here at 2012, and there's other like dangling poles that they have to go down. What is the difference between that kayaking and the sort of kayaking that you've done?
So you have many different disciplines of kayaking within that. And then, so that's slalom. So where they're trying to do it the fastest through the obstacle gates, whereas ours is like flat water. So it's all about speed. So it's all about like it's sprinting, basically, how fast you get to the finish line.
And have you always done a bit more of a sprinting style since when you've started the sport? Or did you ever have an interest in maybe doing some longer versions of the sport?
Yeah, so I did marathon as well, which is, again, it's flat water, but a lot longer. But I did also do white water and slalom because I'm an adrenaline junkie. So I did enjoy those. But competitively, I did the sprint and marathon.
It wasn't long before people started to recognize that you were actually pretty good at this, though, was it? What was the story there? How was your development?
So yeah, I just started training regularly, and then we kind of saw that my times were really improving. I moved up to a bigger training group, changed clubs, and then at 13 got scouted in a race to join GB. So went through the trials, and then became the youngest to get onto GB at 13. So to race in like under 16s and under 18s. So I was a little baby of the group, but yeah, so that's when it all started.
What's it like being 13 and representing your country?
I don't think I really realised at the time like actually how big it was. I think I just thought, oh, this is fun. I get to train and do what I love more. But it was nice. We had a nice group, and yeah, being the youngster, they kind of really looked after me. But obviously I was trying to manage it with school and obviously keep my grades up so that I could keep training. But yeah, it was intense.
And with school, did they have an appreciation for the fact that you needed to focus on that as a bit of a sport, or did you just do the same PE sports that everyone else was doing all the time?
So they did let me sometimes miss some PE sessions, but I still loved all the competitive sports schools, so I never wanted to miss them. So I'd try and add in as much as I could and cram it in, like hockey and swimming. So I was always doing pretty much every sport I could.
I don't want to say that your school would be silly if not to, but did they find a way for you to compete for them in kayaking?
So they then offered like scholarships and things like that. And then, but they quickly dragged me into, rowing, swimming, anything water. I was then immediately put up for racing in. So
amazing. But you didn't end up just racing in British waters. You ended up going international for some of your competitions. So I'm obviously going to at some point ask what that's like. Going international for your sport must be really, really cool, especially at that age. But what was your initial sort of thought process around competing internationally?
I think I always wanted to do it. Like when I started when I was 10 and beat my brother, the first thing I said to my mum when I got off the water is, I'm going to go to the Olympics. Like I was certain of it there. I had that goal, and I always wanted to then go and compete internationally, get the GB kit. It was always a dream I had. And yeah, I mean, at 15, started to make that a reality and started to compete.
So when you're on the start line and you're no longer against people that you've probably raced a few times before, these are people that you've never seen before in their nation's colours, and they all want to go to the Olympics one day as well. What is your thought process? Because you are young, you don't necessarily have the pedigree of racing beforehand. Was it pure excitement, or, if we're being real, were you incredibly nervous?
I was excited for sure, but very nervous because just looking across on the start line, they were all so much bigger than me. I mean, I was under 18s and I was 15. So I was just that young little 15-year-old that no one knew. And it was quite scary seeing how much bigger they were and stronger than me. But it was definitely exciting, like adrenaline filled, which was amazing.
One thing that I'm quite fortunate at, I do get nervous for sport. I think it's always a good thing. I've mentioned this before, but I was told by my dad when I was younger, if you're not nervous, then you've got no hope of winning. Like, only good people get nervous, basically. One of the things I have been fortunate with that is, while I do get nervous, I don't get sweaty palms. But getting sweaty palms in a sport where you predominantly have to pull, is that something you've had to deal with?
Luckily, no, but we also have a lot of grips on our paddles. So if it did get to that point, like, we'd be all right. It's more the blisters that we'd be concerned about. But no, I never struggled with that, I don't think. You get water on your blades and on your hands anyway, so it was inevitable.
Fair enough. Now, with competing at an international level, you mentioned that you were doing this at 15. Were you travelling by yourself, or did you have family coming out to support you?
I tend to do it on my own. I knew my family would be watching back home, like on the live stream, but I'd get really grumpy before racing and not want to like kind of see my family as much. I'd find that a bit more stressful. And I very much went into like the zone of racing. So yeah, they watched from back home. A few races they did come out to see me, but I also had my coaches with me and like obviously team managers and everything. So
did you have a bit of a pre-race routine that they were messing with?
yeah, they would try and like talk to me, and I'm like, no talking to me for like 24 hours beforehand. But yeah, I was pretty strict on my routine. I mean, I had it planned down to the minute what I would be doing. I was very, yeah.
Can you give us a bit of an insight as to what that was?
Yeah, I mean, it would be like, so I'd eat at this time, and times got very specific. It'd be like 8:35, and then if I knew my race time, I'd spend time on this plan beforehand. And then, you know, certain warm-ups I'd do. I had certain music I'd put on. It was always Eminem and stuff like that. So yeah, to get in the zone. Depending which race, if it was longer stuff, I needed slightly more chilled stuff. But if it was sprint, I just needed all the adrenaline I could get. And then, yeah, it would be like right up until I got on the water, what I'd then warm up on the water, and then my start time.
And then it was all guns blazing.
Yeah.
Here we go. Now, this is all very exciting, but we are kind of getting to this point where you turn 16, and we know, because we've had a discussion beforehand, I'm not going to pretend I knew this all along, but when you were 16, you had a bit of a freak accident. Do you want to begin to explain this side of your story?
Yeah, so I just returned home from, you know, World Championships, Junior Olympics, and a freak accident at school left me with a brain injury in hospital and fighting for my life. And everyone was kind of told, prepare for the worst, like this isn't looking good. And then the brain damage I was left with, I had to relearn everything from talking, breathing, eating, moving. So it was intense. I mean, I spent 12 months in hospital, and I think it was 4 months before I said my first words. So it was a long process. Luckily, I don't remember a lot of the first couple months. But yeah, definitely was not what I had planned for that competitive year, and definitely took a toll, but was lucky to make the recovery I did. And when I returned home, kind of convinced my mum 2 weeks after returning home, couldn't walk at this point, but said, can you let me get back in my boat? She was a bit apprehensive. I had some mates there, one of which was a lifeguard, so we kind of convinced her, and then got back in the boat, and that was it. I was like, right, time to compete again.
Now, I want to break this down because I think it's incredible, and I love that you can look at it so simplistically. It's like this happened, and then I was back in the water. But from the standpoint of being someone that is so young and you had such huge dreams, for most people, they're immediately shattered. And I can imagine, especially to a degree, when you're having to reteach yourself how to do, I guess, what you would call some of the most basic things in eating, talking, walking. Like, when you're at that age and you benefit to a degree of having that lone time, what is the sort of thought process that you were having? Did you at any point just go, oh, that's it?
I think a lot of what my family and I were told was, you know, they were being trained on how to take care of me. And at 16, they were trying to tell us she needs to go to a care home. She will not go home. And I think every time they told me I wasn't going to do something or no, it just lit this fire inside of me, because they clearly didn't realize how stubborn I was. And I was just like, I need to prove them wrong. And I guess it was the first big setback I'd ever faced in life. But for me, I just used to visualize being back on the water, and most importantly, back on that start line, where probably was one of the best feelings in the world to me. And a lot of the times, even during, all the rough things are going on, I just held on to that hope. And, you know, I'd say to my family, I'm going to get back on the water, and they'd believe in me as well. So I had that support system there who also believed in me, and I knew I just had to make it possible.
You've kind of answered a question that I was going to go through, which is around rowing being the motivator for it. Because I think back to when I was 16, and I'm sure other people can agree with this, is I played sport. I loved sport. Yeah, I had some goals. I'm going to be honest, I didn't set crazy goals for myself in sport because I didn't really believe that I could. It was a bit weird. I'm very different now. But back then, I would have wanted to play sport, and I would have been adamant that I was going to play sport again. But I don't think I'd been able to turn around and say, I'm going to do this straight away at 16. I don't think I was particularly stubborn enough at the time. And obviously having the support from your family is going to make that a lot easier. But the visualization coming in is a very mature thing to have at that age. And ultimately, we can see that it worked, because you got back there. And not only did you get back on the water, it almost was like it didn't happen. You started competing again. And how did that competing go?
Yeah, I mean, I went back to the World Championships, came away with 2 silvers that year, and then went on to race at Europeans, and kind of was like, yeah, my career as a kayaker was on the up and back focusing on the Olympics. But I kind of had this new whole mindset from what I'd been through. It kind of had made me stronger as a person and loved the sport even more and appreciated it more than I have. So my scores were just getting better and better because there was just something inside of me that was bigger than it had been before about the sport.
This is something that I recently actually read in a book called Endure, which is a book that was actually recommended by one of the previous guests on the podcast, and I think is amazing. Anyone should go and read it. But it's a bit about the psychology, and there are lots of athletes who have achieved possibly more than they would have done had at some point they not had anything taken away from them. And I think that's kind of where you're referring to. You had this new perspective, a new understanding of your sport and how much it meant to you. And it seems like you were able to find an extra push from that. Now, as you get older in your sporting domain, it is pretty normal that you specify a little bit more in terms of, or for some people, it's just reducing the number of sports they do. For other people, it's within a certain sport, choosing one discipline. Did you do that, or did you stay quite open?
I stay quite open because I found that sprint and marathon both could help each other. But I did tend to lean more towards the sprint side, more because it was what was in the Olympics, which marathon's not. And obviously my dream was to go to the Olympics. But still within sprint, there's 200, 500, 1,000 meters. And I couldn't quite make my mind up of which one I liked the most. So I did compete at all 3 and kept on competing at all 3.
Is there one in particular that you did better at?
Probably 500. Although it's, I would say, one of the more brutal one of the distances because of that weird in between of flat out and kind of pacing it. But I just enjoyed it and had a race plan that I got on really, really well with, and would be always the one that I would PB in most of the time. So definitely was my favourite.
Because you've gone more sprint based, the problem with sprinting is that you obviously have to deal with the pressure of, well, not the pressure, but the build-up of lactic in everywhere. At a young age, was there a mentality to kind of offset the pain that you're being put through by your lactic acid as you were trying to sort of approach that finish line in first position? Was there anything that you can remember that you would think at that age to kind of shut that down?
I remember thinking that, especially after I'd been through the injury, I would always say to myself, this is not pain compared to that. And like, you know, you've got this far, you've been through worse. And that would kind of stick with me. Like, remember where you've come from. And that definitely gave me a bit of an extra push whenever I was struggling in training or competing, and would just give me this whole new surge of energy, especially towards the end of the finish line.
So with your career then, and being able to do that and push through, you're having some very positive results again. So were things firmly back on track in your mind? It was all about the Olympics and moving forward for that. And then did something else come along and stop that?
Yep, another curveball. I was at uni at the time and training full time, loving it. And at 19 was in a whitewater kayaking accident, which left me once again fighting for my life. I sustained called a polytrauma, so it's just multiple traumas. So a spinal injury, another brain injury, and multiple orthopedic injuries, so lots of broken bones. And of course, this again was, you know, life-changing. My family were told, prepare for the worst. It wasn't looking good. The odds were kind of stacked against me at this point, but pulled through, was alive, which, you know, was amazing. And then obviously had to face rehabilitation and hospital all over again. So it was another 11 months of relearning, moving and everything like that again. Which obviously I'd lost everything I'd fought so hard to regain. And then again, all I wanted to do was get back on the water.
With this second incident where you've kind of been taken back to a position you're already in the same way that you had previously in your training and in your racing been turning back to that and being like, oh, it's not as bad as that, you've been through worse, all of this. Did you kind of have the same approach when it happened again? In terms of, did you not really, I guess, deep what was going on so much because you were like, I've been here before?
I think, yeah, but it had its negative and positive effects, because I knew what it was about to take to regain what I did, and having, I knew what was going to happen. I think that was hard because I knew the hard work it was about to require and the setbacks that are going to come along with it and challenges. But then again, I would just try and tell myself, you've done it before, you can do it again. Like, let's prove them wrong. Take two.
And was there any fear from the fact that this time it came from an incident in the water and in the boat?
I think at first, maybe a little bit, but as soon as I had hydrotherapy, which is physio in a pool, I definitely hadn't lost my love for the water, and I wanted to get back in it, on it, anything around it. So I'm grateful that I didn't, because I guess for me, water is my home. Like, it's where I spend most of my time, in or on the water. So nothing could take that love away from me.
There was one adaptation that had to be made, though, in that you were now going to have to look towards power rowing. What was that process like? Because there is an element of having to give up part of the sport that you knew. Was that a decision you made, or was that a decision that was kind of guided?
So it was kind of guided. Like, I started to really struggle mentally in my journey before going home, because I'd been in denial for a long time that I wasn't going to walk again,
Siri's just decided to join the conversation here. No, didn't message me before he decided to come on the podcast, so Apple sort that out. Carry on though. So yeah, so was the decision guided then?
Yeah, so I was really struggling mentally, and a physio at the hospital that I was really close with was like, let's get you back on the water. And obviously I was like, well, I can't, like, how am I meant to do this now? And he actually reached out to my local rowing club, explained the situation, and within a week they got me down and they got me in an adapted rowing boat. And it was hard at first, because trying to figure out how I'm meant to move now and kind of compensate and compromise in this situation. But I mean, as soon as I started taking the first few strokes, I was like, okay, I got a new goal now.
With the power boats, my background's like, I did engineering when I was at uni. If people didn't know that, there you go. I'm a bit of a nerd. I'm interested to know kind of what the differences are in terms of the mechanisms within them, because I imagine, and this is actually a question I've got for you. Bearing in mind you have lost the use of some of the limbs in your body, going towards a sport where having as many limbs as possible to help you out is interesting, especially when, if you were to fall in, it would become even more difficult.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that they build the boats pretty carefully for those reasons. But is there any other nuances that you had to adapt to on those boats in comparison to just a normal boat?
So they are completely like adapted boats. So we have like 2 floats on each side to help with capsizing and stability. And also, yeah, for rowing, one of the main muscle groups is your legs. Well, in my case, it wasn't. It all became upper body as well as like my core at the time. And the good thing with rowing is, because it is like a full body sport, it can be adapted really well. I mean, it was intense and brutal. But yeah, it was basically, you have a seat that's fixed in place, and then you're able to use the movement you have, eliminating the use of your legs.
So how long did it take for you to feel comfortable?
I think within the first session, I was like, oh, I like this. Like, hey, it's painful, it's hard, but I like this. It gives me that sense that I used to have in a boat. And then from there, just started doing lots of ergs and rowing machines, and getting on the water as much as we could. And the progress we saw physically and mentally was just huge, bigger than we ever could have imagined. And I didn't know how much rowing was about to save my life in that sense, especially mentally. Like, it gave me something to focus, it gave me purpose again, which I think at the time I really missed.
Because, it's obvious to see why the goals that you had as a kid growing up, and that you were arguably well on track to achieve, had been ripped away from you, well, twice. But was it because you managed to realign the goals of your current situation into setting new ones? And maybe they're not being the Olympic Games anymore, but the Paralympic Games. Is that where your sort of mindset starts to be, okay, I can focus and I can be motivated towards something again?
Yeah, like, I always like to have something I can focus on and work towards, no matter how big it is. And I think for me, it really helped give me something to drive towards. And yeah, I was very quick to decide, okay, Olympics aren't going to happen, Paralympics, let's go for it.
Okay, so how was the training going and the competing going?
Good. I mean, yeah, I went back training full time, got on the GB para team, and was loving it. Set to obviously start competing, and was also doing CrossFit at the time, like seated CrossFit, which I loved because it was so empowering, lifting a weight above my head. And it really helped me start owning the situation of being in a wheelchair and adapt to this new life, as well as going through that grieving process of my old self and kind of finding the Georgia 2.0. And yeah, it was going amazing. I was back with GB, which is all I wanted to do. And the Paralympics were quickly going to become a reality.
There's an interesting use of language that we're doing here at the moment, because you are still a power rower. Yep. That's unchanged, but we're using like past tense words. And that's because lightning never strikes 3 times, but to a degree, it actually did last year. So what was the most recent thing that you had to go through? So
early April last year, just came back from a training camp. I was really well, and then suddenly just got poorly. In a matter of hours, was at home, lost feeling over all my body, taken to hospital, put back in intensive care. And that's when they come and say, you've had a spinal stroke in your neck. So it left me paralysed, my neck down, C4, C5, so quite high up. And obviously there was no sporting accident. There was no like accident or anything. And we were like, why? Why has this happened? So then the investigations began, which involved like muscle biopsies where they take any centimetres of my quad out. Yeah, luckily I had no feeling because they can't use anaesthesia on it because it needs to be active. So yeah, it was grueling testing in London, and then they kind of came in the room and there was a team of them, and you can just tell by their faces like something isn't right, and they're like, okay, we've got your diagnosis. Of course, I'm so excited because I'm like, okay, cool, we know what we're dealing with. What have I got to fight now? And then they say the words MELAS, and I'm like, okay, what? So it's mitochondrial encephalopathy lactic acidosis stroke. Bit of a mouthful.
I was going to say, that's taken some practice.
It's taken some practice.
One of the things for you guys that have been watching me or hearing me talk, I was never, while it's on my piece of paper, I was never intending to say that. I was always going to hand that over to you to do, because there's no way I was going to.
It's taken me practice in learning how to actually pronounce it. But yeah, and then of course my first question is, what's the treatment? Where do we go from here? And then they say the words terminal, and I'm like, I'm 21, and you're telling me I'm terminally ill. And then, of course, we start to figure out, like, I'd had all these random illnesses since the brain injury, really, that no one ever explained, but I always recovered. And then it took the spinal stroke for them to investigate what was going on. And there was a diagnosis. I was a very rare case of it because they'd never seen it. Usually you're born with it and die when you're a child. Obviously, I was 21 and an elite athlete until then. And yeah, that was straight away got put under palliative care, and definitely was in denial about the whole situation for a long time, and was telling everyone how I was going to go to the Paralympics, and was stayed hopeful, but never really let it sink in what was going on.
I can't even imagine what it's like hearing those words come out of someone in professional healthcare. I can't imagine hearing that from them. And no wonder you were in denial for so long. Is it something that even now you feel like you're a bit in denial of, or do you think you've actually come to terms with it and accepted it?
I think it's something you never come fully to terms with. Obviously now I can kind of own it a little bit more, and I have a whole different mindset now about it than I did back then. Because I mean, at the time in hospital, they were just like, it's about comfort and care. You're not going to go home. You're not going to get better. You need to start looking at these other options of, how do you want to spend this time? How do you want to, and not so much about the future and going back rowing. I was pretty much told that's not going to happen. It is impossible. Even if you manage to make it home, you will not survive training. So then, my stubborn self, I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. Like, I will do what it takes. And at the time, I think even my family were a little bit like, you need to like realize what's really going on here. But again, it lit that fire inside of me, and I couldn't let go of my dreams that I'd had for so long. And up until this point, they agreed sport would save my life if I hadn't been fit and healthy going into this. And I was like, well, if sport has saved my life before, it's going to do it again.
That's amazing, but also immediately concerning, because with terminal illnesses, they tend to give you an amount of time, which is why they're probably talking to you about where do you want to put your time and how do you want to use it.
Yeah.
Have you been, are you updated with time, or is it now that you've moved away from that sort of thing and you've got more but into your sport, which is keeping you going, have they kind of just left you to it to continue going?
They don't really know. For me, every time I see them, they like remind me of like the reality of what's going on. And it's there. Obviously, we'll always kind of feel like a ticking time bomb. But again, made me see this whole new perspective of life. As cringe as it is, you don't realise this until this label gets put on your name and you know. But I think, you know, I've got this far. How much further can I get?
What I'd love to know is, everyone's going to die. If that's news to everyone, I'm really sorry. But it being brought forward is something that most people wouldn't want to know about, but it can be useful to know about it, especially because it can give you a different mentality on how things impact you in daily life. Is there a difference that you have noticed in how you process things as a result of that information?
I think for sure, again, like, yeah, my whole mindset has changed. Like, for me, doing the simplest things now brings me so much more gratitude than it ever has. And, you know, the people around me, I obviously spend a lot more time with, and it's definitely seen like how I was prioritizing things before and how I do it now is very different. Like, for example, I've only just got back driving after 2.5 years, and it's just amazing and something I will never take for granted again. But also just the simple things like the sun, being outside, obviously spending so much time in hospital, but also, yeah, not knowing like what the future holds for me is scary. Obviously the uncertainty, of course, is, but could also be exciting, because I always tell myself, what if it turns out better than you could have ever imagined? And that's just something I live day by day. That's amazing. Now, I think something that we discussed beforehand, which I would love to know from the sports science kind of thing, is loads of people end up having to deal with injuries at some point in their career. And there is always a bit of a rehab phase, and you see physio, that sort of thing. In most cases, they don't have to do a total relearning of how to make their body do what it needs to do. In your case, where you've almost effectively had to do this 3 times now, what's the actual process? Not necessarily physio. I'm not too necessarily worried about stretches or some of the independent movements you had to do, but what's the general process that you have figured out has worked for you to get you just back to elite status time after time? Yeah. It would definitely be gradual return. That after the brain injury, I did not do that. I was like, I wanted to go all guns blazing, like, right, but obviously that does not work. You have to kind of slowly build up. And as much as I hate it, it does work. And just building up the intensity, and really I've learned, especially after the spinal stroke, listening to my body a lot more. You know, if I'm tired, I'm well, I need to stop and kind of take a couple of days off so I can come back stronger and keep doing it. But a lot of it would be, I mean, after last year, I started in hospital just with a resistance band on the end of my bed and just trying to do the row movement, because obviously I had no movement neck down at this point. But I knew from the previous times it was always muscle memory and repetition that would help me, and rhythm. And then, yeah, when I got back in the boat, my priority this year was to enjoy it and to love it and do it because I love it, not because I have this dream and goal. Of course, that's great, but I want to do it because I love it. And a lot of it has been, just slowly, like introducing more and more training, kind of really listening to my body better. And I'm lucky I have great coaches who've been really supportive with it all. Because if it was up to me, I would have been racing this year, probably at Paris. But it's, prioritizing my body over everything else at the moment. And do you find a bit of a fascination in how you're able to get the most out of your body with everything you've got? And if you do, is there anything in particular that you've found in your training particularly works really well for you to get the best out of a training session, or even in competition? Is there anything that you do to get the best out of yourself? Definitely warming up. I was never good at it. And now it's definitely, needed. But I always go back to visualization. Like, it's been with me, like, the whole journey. And obviously now, as I said before, during races, that kind of extra push from remembering where I came from. And actually we've got like a small gym at home, and I've got three things, one from each of the setbacks from where it started. You know, the kayak accident was my cut off pointy vest, and the spinal stroke last year was just like a hospital wristband. They're up on my wall to remember where I came from, and it always helps to kind of put that in perspective of what I'm doing now is, you know, I was told would be impossible, but it's not.
One final thing that I want to touch on, because I think what we're getting across here is that mentally you are incredibly strong, even if at times you've self-admitted that it hasn't always been. And we will talk about that a little bit. But one final thing I want to touch on is that you now row 2Ks as your preferred distance. For anyone that has never done a 2K test on a rowing machine, and actually, do you know what? I'm going to hold my hand up here and say I've not done one yet. I'm supposed to do one very, very soon. But I have worked off the idea of what my 2K time would be, and I've kind of just picked a time that I hope I can achieve. A 2K, for anyone that has done one, you've probably sat here with butterflies in your stomach because it is a grim distance. It's a bit like for anyone that has run the 400 meters or the 800 meters, or anyone that has done on a bike, usually like a 5K on a bike, because it's a similar sort of time.
Yeah.
But it's a really awkward thing because it takes so much effort. Yet there is still that degree of pacing, but still by the time you finish, there should be nothing left in the tank. Why the hell would you choose that distance?
Good question. I don't know. I think part of me loves the pain, although that sounds absolutely crazy. I think any elite athlete, you get addicted to it, and it's the endorphins it gives you after. Yes, it hurts during it. Yes, I'm probably questioning why I'm doing rowing during it, but it's after, like, you feel on top of the world, and for me, that's nothing can match that feeling.
I think, do you know what? I'm going to make a bit of a statement here because I haven't met him yet, and I probably won't meet him unless this podcast pops off all of a sudden. But I think David Goggins could do with a couple of lessons from you, because I think just the what you've come back from, retrained yourself, and then to even just throw yourself into probably the most grim discipline of your sport just for the hell of it is very, very commendable. And I think what it must come from is some of those depths in mentality as well, because when you're reflecting on how bad things have been, yes, there will have been physical pain, but there's also the grief from losing elements of yourself, to be honest. Is there anything on your mental journey, aside from having your routine back and aside from having some goals in rowing, that you found has particularly helped you get back to where you are today?
Definitely. I think one thing I used to do a lot of is trying to look way too far ahead. And obviously I'm in a hospital bed looking at the Olympics and be like, well, how am I going to get there? So it was kind of, I made a goal each day or every few days, even if it's the smallest thing. I mean, obviously speaking, like, that was a big goal. But last year, trying to reuse my arms, like, to be able to feed myself 1 spoonful or 2. And, you know, just being able to tick them off and watch me get closer and closer really helped to put me into kind of, not focusing too far ahead, of being too hard on myself, which I did a lot of. And as cliche as it is, day by day, I used to hate when people said it to me. I was like, oh, but you guys don't know. But it's true, day by day, like, and even now, I don't know what's around the corner. So for me, it's just to live every day as I can. And, you know, I want to go to bed with a smile on my face and wake up with a smile on my face and do everything that I can. And a lot of what I'm now learning is that I love rowing, but my life doesn't have to revolve around just rowing. And those blinkers kind of got removed that had been on for so many years. So, you know, now I'm doing all these crazy adventures and planning to break a world record next year. Like, for me, it's not just rowing that gives me that. It's kind of these crazy adrenaline-filled activities and clearly putting my body through pain. But yeah, it's definitely been hard. And I think a lot of last year I wouldn't have got through if actually my mental health hadn't really struggled the year before, because during that time it taught me, okay, I need to open up, I need to talk to people, which I never did until then. And then facing a major setback again, I felt much more ready to face it than I had ever before. And also, allowing myself to rest, allowing myself to be angry at the world and ask why me sometimes, you know, I'm gonna. But then, of course, why not me? Like, what can this story teach me? Because I found so many things that I never would have had the opportunity to have found or learn if I hadn't have been through everything I have. And I think I really like to try and focus on that a lot of the time. Like, from incredible people I've met and just, things I've experienced, and it's been incredible despite all the setbacks and challenges.
I really like the answer you've given there, and you've almost stolen one of the questions from the listener questions in terms of your answer. So I might ask you to elaborate here, but we'll move into the listener questions section of the podcast. So for those that don't know, every time I have a guest on, I like to open up a poll or like a questions box on Instagram where you can go over and ask a question for the upcoming guest based on some information about them. Just as a shameless plug again, at mindsets_podcast is where you can find that. But we've had some really good questions in today, and I've chosen the top 3. And the first one, which we will now ask because you've just mentioned it, is Silas has messaged and said, do you ever get caught in thinking, why me? And what is your way out of that?
Yeah, I well, me, of course. Like there's definitely been times where I have questioned why me again and again. Like, and I think is it like, why not me? There's, I never really liked the saying, there's always a reason, but I kind of have come to realize there is. You just have to fight to find it. And for me now, it's, as the incredible challenges that I'm now going on, like hand cycling around North Wales, I never would have done before. Things like this, I never would have done before. It's definitely opened my eyes to a whole different world and the lessons I've learned from it. But also, I think, as time goes on, I am learning my new life, that I'm actually realizing, despite in the past not ever believing that it would be, that life can be beautiful again, even if it's not how I ever envisioned it would be, that it can still be incredible. And I think especially having this terminal diagnosis, although I'll never let it define me, has definitely taught me so much that probably most people will never learn. And I think that is a gift in itself.
Wow. Well, that's an incredibly good answer. So I hope Celeste enjoys that one. The next question we've got is from Rianne. And she says, pretty simply, how do you stay so motivated? And one of the questions I've got for you as well, to tag onto that is, or is it discipline?
Yeah, so I'm not always motivated. There are times, as I said, like dark times where I have been like, I'm ready to give in. I don't want to do this. But then, I'd see something, or a photo or something, and remember why I'm fighting, see the people around me, and be reminded that I'm not alone. And I think being an athlete beforehand definitely helped, because, I was training from a young age in a really hard sport, and it was hard, it was tough. You didn't always want to train. But going into all these setbacks, it taught me so much, and not only physically being stronger, but mentally being stronger going into them. And then the sense of overcoming something you're told you never will was the best feeling in the world as well. I remember, only last week I just got back from the hand cycle, and I went to a meeting with a palliative care team who I haven't seen since I was really, really poorly last year. And the look on their faces made it all worth it. They were like, because obviously, like this time last year I could hardly move, and now I'm off doing these crazy things. Definitely gives me motivation, but it's just finding motivation in the small things. And even if it does mean, okay, taking a step back, spending time sad and, angry, and finally letting myself feel those things to then come back stronger. But also I know every training session I do that I'll feel better after, and it really helps me. It's kind of a form of therapy for me. So I think that's always helped me as well. And these goals and dreams I have, I'm not willing to give up on. So
I've got one question for you. Be honest with me. Do you know how many doctors you've proved wrong at this point? Do you have a count?
No, I should work that one out. No, I don't. I mean, it's a fair few at this rate. Yeah, they're racking up.
Okay, so the last question. I chose this one just because I think it's a funny question, but the person did ask, we kept it anonymous. So, what is the coolest / weirdest thing you found from being in a wheelchair that people wouldn't know about?
Oh, I mean, obviously there's a thing, like, you never realize like curbs on pavements and everything until you're in a wheelchair. It's like, you definitely don't realize a lot. Also, like, everyone looks tall to me. So I can't imagine standing now and being so far off the ground. It makes me feel a bit weird thinking about it. I don't know, because your body gets so used to seated. But the best part about being in a wheelchair is like on a tube, I always have a seat. Concert, I always have a seat. Pub, I bring my own chair. So it definitely has its benefits. And, you know, some of the nice interactions you actually gain from it. But yeah, it's definitely different. It is weird, but now it's kind of my norm. So the small things I kind of forget. But yeah, it is weird.
One thing I want to mention is near where I live, there's some gravel. And I would recommend that people take this approach. We actually discussed this beforehand.
Yeah.
But if you're out in public and you can see someone struggling, in your eyes, struggling, that's a really important thing. Don't necessarily just help. Like, always wait to be asked. Maybe be in the presence to be able to be asked, but don't just start helping. That's something that you've experienced as well. But when you arrived here, there's some gravel around, and gravel and thin wheels is going to be a bit of an awkward thing, especially when there's some small wheels at the front. And as I went to ask if I could help in any way, you just popped a wheelie and just started like just wheeling along. And I was like, I don't know if she's just trying to get through the gravel or if she's like flexing how much of an athlete she is in this
People always
wheelchair.
think I'm flexing when I do that. And I'm like, no, there is purpose. But yeah, but you learn these cool tricks. Like being in a wheelchair can be fun at times. Obviously, you don't recommend it. But like hills, I see how fast I can get down a hill now and then regret it when I have to get back up. But there are some great things about being in a wheelchair, like, you know,
that.
the wheelies.
I love that mentality.
They have ended wrong very many times, though, which would have been really
imagine.
awkward if I just fell out the back of the chair.
Yeah, I would have also felt awful, and then I would have permanently become someone that helped without being offered. So there we go.
would have
Went
laughed.
for the
It's all right.
So that brings us to the end of the listener questions, and that means that we need to do just a little bit more internal reflection. So normally we do a 3 pieces of advice section here. However, in the past, I've just decided to mix it up because I can. And I'm going to do that today in terms of we sometimes ask people for 3 pieces of advice for a younger version of themselves. However, I would love to know 2 pieces of advice for a younger version of yourself and 1 piece of advice for a future version of yourself. And I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, start with younger. I think one that I definitely would like to tell younger self is not everything's going to go to plan, and that's okay. Your life's not going to end, but it is going to look different. But as I said earlier, it doesn't mean you're not going to have these crazy goals and achieve amazing things, because I was definitely stuck on my one path, and obviously, yeah, that's been tested. Another would probably be take time out. Obviously, I had to give up a lot as an athlete. Although I don't regret that because I was traveling the world competing, which was incredible and something many 15, 16-year-olds aren't doing. I did have to miss out on a lot. And I think looking back, I wish I had lived a little bit more as a teenager as well. Although it did make me be very well behaved and like everything, I couldn't go out partying and drinking. Like it did keep me, I sometimes wish I had a bit, especially now. And then future self. I guess like I never know what my future's gonna hold, but all I'd say to my future self is hold on to that hope you've always had. Don't let it go, because I think the one thing about my story that I'd always hope to share is there is always hope, no matter how many people tell you to give up or tell you your life will never be the same. If you believe in yourself, then who knows what can happen.
Very, very solid advice. And obviously, the secret purpose of this is that we can all get some free advice as well. So we can utilize that. Which takes us to the final question, though. And the final question is the previous guest question. So between each episode, one guest gets to ask the next guest a question while also answering one from the previous guest. So we had Harry on. Now, we were a bit cheeky. And the last 2 episodes were actually technically 1 episode, but it was a longer episode, and some of the stories in there were interesting enough to definitely make it worth splitting across the 2. But that meant that we did go an episode without a question. But we're back to normal. This is 1 episode, and we do actually have a question from Harry for Georgia. So the question is, what is it in your mind that switches to get you back on track?
I think, again, it just goes back to that feeling I get when I cross the finish line. It's a feeling I held on to for a long time during those dark times in hospital, because all I wanted to do again was have that feeling, no matter what form it was. Definitely that. but also the people around me. Like, I would not be here today if it wasn't for my friends, family who were there every day. And, you know, whenever I achieve something small or big, they're there to cheer me on, or in the darkest times, they were there too. So now being able to defy the odds with them by my side and being able to live and have them with me kind of always puts things into perspective for me and reminds me of a lot. And I think, yeah, just remembering, as I've said all along this episode, of where I came from.
A question that I've got for you, actually, this kind of a guilty question. I'm asking this for my own reasons, but hopefully someone else can learn from it. When I do something, when I finish a race, when I achieve something, especially within the sports and fitness world, I typically don't enjoy it. In the terms of course, I don't hate it, but I usually see that as a box that has been ticked so I can get better. I don't necessarily, for that instance, enjoy what I've achieved very often. What I'd love to know is if that's something that you also experienced previously, maybe it's something you still experience, or do you actually find that now you really do enjoy every time you cross that finish line?
I think before, yeah, I was like you, I didn't, more because I'd be beating myself up, being like, that wasn't good enough. Even if I won, like when I won Worlds, I was still beating myself up about it, like criticizing all things that could have gone better. And I guess now everything's completely shifted of, I just feel grateful to be able to cross that line again. And obviously I got my first race in a week that I haven't raced in years, and it's probably going to be a very emotional one to cross that line, because I know how hard I've fought to get there. And I think this time I appreciate the journey a lot more than I ever have. And yeah, see beauty in the journey. And kind of this race is one step closer to that dream I've had since I was 10. So
this is the first race back, and you are on the road to try and make the Paralympic squad later this year, and then also you've mentioned that there's a world record you're going for next year. A question that I've got, which I think is fundamentally more important than all of those things, is what is the song choice now? Because it was Eminem. Have you got a preloaded playlist for the first race? Yeah,
it still has Eminem. Like, okay. I mean, on the hand cycle last week it was like a 5-mile hill, and they just put on Eminem, and I was like, great, now I'm fine. I also have a lot of songs I actually listened to when I was in hospital that are quite uplifting or motivating, or I could resonate with, and I've put them in the playlist because when I last listened to them, I was in the hospital bed fighting for my life, and now I'm about to go and do something I've worked so hard for.
Damn, that's so hard. That's so cool.
So I was like, it's either gonna make me cry or like race harder, probably both. But yeah, I was like, do you know what? This race probably means so much more than a race ever has to me. So
what song sticks out?
There's one called Unbreakable, I think, by Imagine Dragons, something like that. And it just talks about like, yeah, coming back basically, and a lot of them, yeah, are about kind of motivation, coming back after something. So there's a lot of those in there.
I have a final question to ask you, which is related to the guest question. So I'm going to need, obviously, a question from you to the next guest. It can be as silly or as deep as you want. Obviously, Harry's to you was a little bit more deep. However, you'll find this quite amusing as well. Harry's answer to his question, which was, what's the most embarrassing thing that's happened to you in sport? He actually defecated all over a rowing machine. So that's bizarre. If you've heard this and you don't believe that, go back and listen to that story amongst Harry's other stories, because that one is probably the funniest of them all. But what question would you like to ask the next guest, not having a clue who they're going to be?
What is your proudest moment to date?
Okay. We will find out what the proudest moment is, and I'll obviously do some digging as to find out why that's their proudest moment. But that means that you need to come back for the next episode to figure out who I'm asking and what their response is. Now, Georgia, you've been fantastic today. Thank you very much for making the trip. I'm glad that you got to use this as an excuse to just get behind the wheel of the car again. But what I want to ask is, where can people find you? And is there anything else that they can support on your journey?
Instagram, Georgia Carmichael.
I'll tag it. Don't worry, guys.
Thanks.
Head down to the bio or head to the description of the podcast. You'll find it.
Yeah, that's the main one to use, I think.
Fantastic.
And keep out LA 2028. I'll be there.
LA 2028. That's where we'll be. We'll have guest passes by then, I'm sure. And we'll be
I
in
need
the
all in
box.
cheerleading outfits, so
You tell us what color, we'll be there.
perfect.
Amazing. So, guys, thanks very much for tuning in. It's been another episode. I've really enjoyed it. I've mentioned it a couple of times already, but if you head over to any of the social pages, which are at mindsets_podcast, drop it a follow, sprinkle a few likes in there, maybe share it with a friend. We are doing our best to tell some of the most inspiring stories in sport for you guys to listen to, learn from, and maybe even adopt some mentalities and mindsets going forward. So do check it out. I appreciate any support you do provide. And I very much look forward to seeing you in the next episode. We've got to do a quick roundup because we've got some photos to pick up, but we'll see you in the next one.